UCF fans, welcome back to another edition of the Daily Night. I am your host, Brian Smith, and I'm also the publisher at Inside the Knights on Fan Nation, powered by Sports Illustrated. Today's show is going to be a little bit different than some of the others that I do about recruiting. It's going to be very specific. It's going to be about the state of Alabama and what UCF has done to date, why they should continue onto that path, and why UCF will have long-term success if they do. With that being stated, this is a piece-by-piece situation. The people that think they know recruiting probably don't if you look at some certain states like Ohio, Louisiana, certain sections at least of Texas, definitely the state of Alabama. There are some states that are just really hard to recruit unless it's logistically easy for you, meaning your campus is within a 5-hour radius of that state, because the kids don't leave that much. Well, UCF is one of those that can do that. And in addition to it, the following is unbelievably important. And it's point number one and the main point of this entire podcast: relationships. People, no matter the business, are going to ultimately have success or failure based on the communication they have within the relationships they have built with people across the aisle. Who are you doing business with? And in this case, there's 3 or 4 ways to look at it. High school coaches, that's the number one thing. I'll delve into that just a little bit in a moment. The parents, definitely got to think about that. 7-on-7 coaches, as much as college guys who are rolling their eyes that are listening to this podcast, like it or not, if you don't deal with 7-on-7 coaches, you cost yourself recruits. A lot of them. And then, of course, the recruits themselves. So the people that are around, guardians, parents, grandparents, whatever, that's all kind of lumped in. You got high school coaches, 7-on-7 coaches, and the recruits. UCF has contacts within the state of Alabama at all those levels because of the following. Not only did Coach Malzahn come to UCF from Auburn, he not only brought some guys from Auburn that were on his staff, he also had administrative staff / students that came over from Auburn. They all dealt with the state of Alabama, the state of Florida, the state of Georgia. Hint, that's the same 3 states that UCF is recruiting. Alabama is one of those. Now, within that, think about this. The tight ends coach, Brian Blackman, was a football coach at the high school level in the state of Alabama. He knows guys around the state. Whether you're at Saraland, which is just on the north edge of Mobile, or whether you're at some public school 10 minutes outside of Huntsville, which is on the north edge close to Tennessee, and that's 5 hours away, people know each other. If Coach Blackman picks up the phone and he's recruiting some kid at Daphne High School, which is on the east edge of Mobile, and he's talking to the coach there, and they have a relationship, that coach can probably tell him about another player. He's like, hey, you should know about this kid. He's been running track. He's taking football serious. He's going to be a sophomore this year, but I've seen him. One of my kids who also runs tracks just said he was the fastest guy at this event. You need to get on him. That's relationships. That's just one example, and that happens all the time. Happens in Florida a lot, and that's why I can say that, covering this state so much. UCF has those types of advantages in the state of Alabama. Now, UCF's success in terms of relationships did not pan out on the 15th of December. They didn't sign a single kid from Alabama. That's disappointing. There's no way around it. But they're also something else to think about. You're not just signing high school and or junior college kids anymore. For UCF, and this is just my own projection, no insight from anybody else, moving forward, I will project UCF to sign 1/3 of their incoming players, just use generic term, players, from the portal. So that's 1/3 you can't sign from the high school ranks directly. But that, again, come back to it. UCF recruits a kid. He goes off to some other school. It doesn't work out. He transfers. Maybe they get him then. Some of the kids that they've gotten already this year, they knew in some way, shape, or form from prior recruiting relationships. Could be any state, but Alabama is part of that. Now, This is not your traditional state. It's obviously very difficult to recruit Alabama for certain kids, and it's just subjective on the year. What the head coach at Auburn or Alabama's great right now, but even if they were terrible, if they were 2-10 and they want a kid in state, I mean, truly, from the get-go, offer and recruit and ardently pursue, it is damn near impossible to get that kid to leave the state. Because if they're doing it, so is Auburn. And chances are, 9 times out of 10, if that kid is truly from that state, he's going to go one of the two. That's fair. But out of the 21 kids that UCF extended an offer to, at least according to 24/7, and how many of those were committable all the way through and et cetera is debatable. But just to use the math, out of those 21 players, only 7 have signed with Auburn or Alabama. That may be shocking to a lot of people, but consider the following. Recruiting used to be totally different because only 5 to 10 schools really recruited nationally, and the vast majority of them were not schools you think of as football schools. And it was just based on academics. Rice, for example. Most people don't even know that school exists, and they sure as heck don't know where it's at. It's a Division I school. It's in Houston. It is elite, elite, elite academically. They can't just get kids locally. They can't get most of those kids in. They can't. They got to recruit everywhere. Vanderbilt, Duke, to a certain extent, Virginia, Wake Forest, Notre Dame, Stanford. Those schools all recruit nationally because of academics. And then there's a few others that have too. Ohio State, Michigan did to a certain degree. But until just recently, most of the schools down south just recruited regionally. A, they didn't really need to, and B, it was expensive. Well, with the influx of money into programs, Alabama being a great example for this podcast, the Crimson Tide, by and large, recruit out of state. The reason is they're just one of the 2 or 3 schools in the country that can get away with it. The in-state loyalty within the Yellowhammer State is not really comparable to many places. Louisiana and Ohio, I would put right there. That's about it. But at the same time, when they do go after a kid, as mentioned, it's hard to get them away. So got to pick your spots. If Alabama's A to B going after a kid, unless he's just a dog and you're going to throw your hat in the ring, you're probably wasting your time. But they're not going to offer many kids and really go after them because they want some kid from California, they want a kid from Chicago, a kid from New Jersey, Miami, whatever it is. UCF can pick their spots and they can supplement their recruiting class. Here's a stat for you. Out of the players they signed from the high school ranks on the 15th of December, the first signing day, 10 are from Florida. That's right where they want to be. You get a few from Georgia, a few from Texas, blah, 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 whatever it is in a given year. They got 3 from Georgia and 1 from Texas this year, if I remember correctly, but whatever the number is, that's really good. That's really good. Now the question is, how do you find a way to just get 1 or 2 more guys? And in most years, it'll happen. So with that, I have a little list here. Number 1, it's what I was just talking about, relationships. That just is by far, it's really number 1, 2, and 3. If you don't have relationships, you're not getting players out of states like Alabama very often. If it's a kid that's truly from there. For people that don't know, I could spend a 5-hour podcast and you still wouldn't understand. The culture in Alabama is loyalty. In just about anything, not just football. Loyalty. You're not going to get many of them. But because those schools don't offer everybody, and Auburn recruits out of state quite a bit too. They hit Georgia, they hit South Carolina, they hit Tennessee, they hit Houston. They go everywhere too. It's pretty difficult not to say there's a chance to get a couple of kids a year. So, and it's a deep state too. The number 15 kid in Alabama would be comparable to the number 3 player in most states. It's just true. So they've got a football culture. With that, consider this point. If UCF can dip into the talent pool, specifically on the defensive side of the ball, they will greatly improve their program. For whatever reason, for as long as I have followed football, and that's a long time, that state has always had D-line. And this next class, 23, is insane. how many top-end guys are. And UCF knows who they are. They've had Peter Woods on campus. He's arguably the best player in the state of Alabama for 23. I recently went to the state championship and watched him single-handedly take apart Phoenix City Central's offensive line, and they're pretty good offensive line. He just destroyed them. They could not block him. Even with two guys, he would still get in the backfield. When you have guys like that, it's good. And he may not even be the best player in the state. It just depends on who you ask. It's ridiculous. You have to recruit those kids. Peter's been on campus at UCF, so just doing that, again, relationships. He was here last summer. They need to continue that. Even if he signs with Auburn or Alabama, and most people expect him to go to the latter, maybe it doesn't work out and he transfers. And that's the next point. Those relationships will translate to the transfer portal. Take Tylen Grape. He's the kid they got recently out of Jacksonville State. He's from a small town in Georgia, another state that Gus and his staff at Auburn recruit hard. They knew about him. He was a late bloomer, 250 or whatever, and rolling into college, grows into being an offensive tackle. The rest is history. He's a guy you want on your staff or on your roster. That's a relationship. He could have just as easily been from some small town in Alabama. They have relationships all over Alabama. The transfer portal could end up being, it'd be interesting to study this in 5 years. How many players are on the roster from Alabama? How many of them they got directly from high school, and how many of them they got from the portal? I'm going to lean towards the second, because a lot of times it doesn't work out at Auburn or it doesn't work out at Alabama, just for whatever reason. Even Bobby Bowden went to Alabama and transferred right away. Once he saw how good the competition was, Bobby was at some small school, and the rest is history. Next, this leads to long-term success. Long-term success. You're going to have a few people inevitably that come onto the UCF roster from the state of Alabama. They're going to do well. Remember that word loyalty? Well, they're also not stupid. They're going to look and see who's developing players. UCF's got a pretty darn good coaching staff. That staff is going to change the lives of some kids that'll get drafted. Years 2, years 3, years 4, once we get into that, I mean, we're getting ready to start year 2. Gus hasn't even been at UCF a full year. I believe it was the 15th of February, 2021 that he was hired. You're talking about an opportunity. All of a sudden, not only do you have relationships and all that, but you've got kids that come to campus, like a Peter Woods, who can talk to somebody who's from the state of Alabama, but is living in Orlando and attending UCF. That is critical. That's something that hasn't happened quite the same. I mean, some of the kids that have transferred over, they're from other states that were at Auburn. They transferred to UCF, etc. But it's going to mean a little bit more when a kid that actually went to a high school in the state of Alabama transfers to UCF or comes to UCF or both by way of being recruited by this staff. And once that does, and they can talk to other kids that come in, it'll get the ball rolling. They do need, you got to get the first one, whoever it may be, that's truly a kid that just grew up his whole life in the state of Alabama, or at least like 10 years. That'll change some things. The last point that I want to make is a very important one, and it's one I make quite often. Take heed in the following, because UCF likes to claim they do their own evaluations, and they do. This is very pivotal. Again, UCF's competing against Alabama and Auburn, but they really don't go after a lot of the kids in state. 7 out of the 21 kids they offered signed with one of those two programs, Alabama or Auburn. This state we're talking about here, the Yellowhammer State as it's called, produces a lot of diamonds in the rough because it is a rural state, for the most part, farming state, and there are a lot of kids not next to an airport. Due to COVID, just due to budgets, whatever, schools are doing everything they can to cut back on recruiting costs. In short, they want to cheat. They want to watch my podcast and find out about a kid. They want to watch a video they get sent from one of 5,000 services they have. They want to pick up the phone and call somebody like Chad Simmons or whatever that's one of the recruiting analysts that's been around forever. They want to cut corners. And they also want to fly into one spot and do one-stop shopping. Birmingham, Mobile, to a certain degree, Montgomery, maybe Huntsville, but not a lot. And they're done. There are kids all over the place that are good, and sometimes right on the edge of a city. And I got a kid I'm going to talk about here who I just tweeted about because he just put up his junior film. Really good football player, and it's one that I went and saw last year during my trip through the 3 states. Wide receiver from Moody, Florida. It's just on the edge of Birmingham. It's like 15 minutes out, if that, maybe like 10, 8. He's a kid that was a basketball guy. They got him to come out, and he's a difference maker. But because he plays at a program that's not tradition rich like Thompson, Phoenix City Central, Pinson Valley, they're a gazillion, Trustville, whatever. You have to look at it a little differently. And again, do your own evaluations. UCF does. This kid doesn't have a whole bunch of offers yet. He will. When he goes through the camp circuit again this year, maybe play 7-on-7 or whatever, people see his wingspan. Daveon Dozier is a great example of what you can find in Alabama. You can't just go by offers there. It's a very, very unique state, maybe the most unique. People are scared to death to offer kids in Alabama because they think they're wasting their time. And a lot of coaches have egos. They hate losing recruiting battles. So they're not going to compete with Nick, let alone competing with whoever's at Alabama at the time. And right now it's Coach Harsin. But again, if you don't get them the first time, you can get them in the portal. And a lot of these kids I'm talking about, like number 8 on down the list in the state, they're really good. UCF can definitely get some of those kids and they can be difference makers, but they may not get an offer from Alabama. And that's okay. You need to get them on campus. You need to see them. You need to meet them. Do they fit your program? That's it. Every evaluation is one of its own. There are no exceptions to that. Regardless of how good a player is, you must do your own evaluations. And that's one of the reasons I support how UCF recruits. Too many schools recruit off of a stupid list, kind of like the one I'm looking at just for offers. Well, he's ranked here, so we're going to recruit that. I mean, this is dumb. You have to do your own evaluations. Trust me, there are schools that do that. With that, I just want to wrap up with the same thing that I started with, relationships. Because of the relationships that UCF has already built, we're talking about a different kind of scenario at UCF right now than what we would have had, say, 2-3 years ago. Malzahn probably likes recruiting more than the staff that was here prior, especially the head coach. He's done a pretty good job at Tennessee. Maybe he's got his juices going. He just got there, but that wasn't his forte. Malzahn and this staff just enjoy it. Travis Williams in particular gets a lot of credit, but there's some other really good recruiters on this staff, and the back office does a really good job too. They look at some of the kids off the radar, kind of like I do on my other podcast. The FGA report is talking about kids all over Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. They'll look at whoever they think is good, and they'll go after. Tyler Griffin's probably the best example from this past class. Tyler is a freakish athlete. If he'd have been from Atlanta or Birmingham, he'd have had 10 more offers. They didn't care. They saw the film. They went after it. Relationships. They knew guys. They talked to them. They did their homework, and they offered him a scholarship, got him on campus. The rest is history. UCF will do a good job with that, and they will supplement in the state of Alabama. I'm going to guess 1 or 2 players a year on average, with 15, 16 kids coming in from the high school / junior college ranks. I will say 1 kid at least a year will come from Alabama over, let's say, Malzahn's at UCF for 8 years. He'll average at least 1 kid. And some of those players are going to be starters, and probably starters fairly early. And there also could be 1 or 2 that come in from the transfer portal. That's I'm not even going to remotely begin to project that. I have no idea because you don't know who's leaving today or tomorrow. That's just part of it. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Make sure you check out Inside the Nights on Fan Nation, powered by Sports Illustrated. Doing a lot of stuff in terms of combining, if you will, the roster, recruiting, the transfer portal over the last week or two. Until we get to spring practice, it's more about analyzing. There's not a lot of details about football, and that's a good thing. The players and the coaches need a rest. But recruiting, there is another signing day coming up on the 2nd of February. I'll be talking about whoever they bring in. I know Coach Malzahn is already what me and some of the other guys in the media know. Hey, we can't announce anything yet on some of the other transfers. I know some guys are going to get, etc. Let the kids do their thing. I'm not going to blow anybody's information. That's terrible. Let them announce on Twitter or whatever it is they decide to do, Instagram, YouTube. That's their business. I will talk about them. And then at some point, Coach Malzahn wants to do a press conference, kind of going into it as well. And I'll have an opportunity to pick his brain along with everybody else, Jason Bede and everybody in the media as well. It'll be fun. It'll be very intuitive because these are straightforward. This isn't a rocket science thing, but they're still important questions. You know, what was the final piece for you offering him? What was your relationship like? It's stuff like that. It's still intriguing. And I think it's a very important part because now UCF has not only, as Gus likes to say, hey, a guy leaves, you got to replace him. You know, you got to do the math. They're kind of fitting their culture and finalizing. I'm hoping, at least from my perspective and my evaluation, that the culture is narrowed, if you will. And part of it is the transfer portal. They're being selected, but they're getting some good players, guys that can play this class coming into 22. And they'll get some more after spring ball. There'll be some kids, for whatever reason, it doesn't work out. And as I've said before, like remember last year, Bryson, Big Cat, some other guys, they came after spring. The transfer portal does not stop. Never forget that. It could be July 4th at 7 o'clock and somebody could announce they're transferring in or out of UCF. That's just the nature of the beast. There is no clock on it. So keep that in mind. Make sure that you understand the transfer portal is going to be UCF's friend too, and from the state of Alabama. So with that, everybody, once again, I hope you have a great day. Thank you very much and take care.